Hello everyone, welcome back to Reading in Isolation. I'm Heather Rose, I'm one half of the children's author Angelica Banks. I write these books with my dear friend Danielle Wood, and Angelica Banks is our pen name, and we are up to chapter 15. Now this is a big chapter. It shows what you can do with a big problem in a book, and there are a number of big problems, as you know, in Finding Serendipity. One is that Tuesday can't find her mum. And now we're about to have another very big problem emerge. Chapter 15. Without putting on her dressing gown or even her slippers, Serendipity Smith bolted out of her bedroom and dashed up the stairs to the writing room, where Dennis had fallen asleep in the red velvet chair near the open window. "Dennis, Dennis," she said urgently, kneeling beside her husband and shaking him into wakefulness. I know how to do it. I know how to get back." "What?" asked the befuddled Dennis, lifting his head stiffly from where it had fallen, his face marked from the plush pattern of the fabric. "It's something I'd forgotten. About sailors," said Serendipity triumphantly. "What are you talking about?" "When a sailor is buried at sea, the boatswain on the ship stitches the body inside a shroud. But there is a tradition that the very last stitch goes right through the sailor's nose. You know, the middle bit of your nose, between the nostrils." "The septum, Serendipity, my sweet, that super-sensitive flesh of the nose is known as the septum," said Dennis, blinking patiently at his wife. "But please tell me what this has to do with Tuesday, or anything for that matter." "Well, they do it to make sure the sailor is actually dead, that he's not just unconscious or something, to make sure they're not going to bury anyone alive." I'm not following," said Dennis, perplexed. "Don't you see, I didn't end the book. Not entirely. Vivian Small and the final battle is not over yet because I didn't put the end at the end. Remember the little silver thread in the box? How she thought about putting it on the end of the manuscript. And then she decided to leave it, yeah? Even though the final battle is over and Mothwood has apparently fallen to his death, I didn't finish the book. I decided to sleep on it. And thank goodness I did, because all I have to do to get back there and find Tuesday is to keep the story going. There has to be another chapter." "That's all very well, my love, but I fail to see what it has to do with needling noses." "Watch me," she said. Perching herself on the edge of her chair, Serendipity took from her drawer a new sheet of paper and threaded it into the typewriter. "Mothwood's not dead after all," she muttered to herself as she readied her hands over the keys and began typing. Soon she had written about Mothwood's body being laid out on the deck of the Silverfish, carried there by his men from the rocks where he had fallen. At nightfall, the men returned to the shore and lit a great bonfire on the beach, and there they drank and sang and told stories of the fearless and filthy acts of Caston Mothwood, now deceased. At some time, long after midnight, the men rowed back to the Silverfish and gathered together on deck for the ceremony, where they would sew the body into the shroud before tossing it overboard into the restless sea. From there, the body would sink to the seafloor, making food for fish who would surely delight at eating the remains of the great pirate Caston Mothwood. As Serendipity wrote, describing how Mothwood's men covered a chest on deck with a salt-stained canvas and lifted the broken form of Mothwood onto it, her words began to lift off the page and circle around her. Serendipity continued, trying not to whoop with glee. Next, she described how the sailors drew straws for who would sew the shroud, for it was an honour of the highest order to do this for a captain, and any sailor worth his salt can sew a seam with a neat and even hand. She wrote about how the pirates cheated and lied and fought over the drawing of straws, and then she stopped, wondering why the words had not scooped her up and floated her out the window. Instead, they were hovering in the air above her, not encircling her arms and legs as was usual. "Dennis," she said quietly, not wanting to frighten the words, "something's wrong." "There seems to be a shortage of stickiness," he said, "a lack of levitation." "Why?" Serendipity asked in frustration. "Why?" The words hung in the air in silvery loops just above her head. She reached out as if to catch them, but they slipped from her grasp. She turned back to the typewriter, wielding her fingers like bullets against the keys. And this is what she wrote. Finger sewed the shroud with perfect stitches while the men watched on. Dawn was approaching. Pirate law was very specific. A burial must take place at dawn to ensure a quiet resting place for the dead, while a burial at dusk would make a ghost of the dead sailor forever. As dawn approached, Finger sped up the sewing and the pirates held the lanterns high so the light of 20 flames illuminated the corpse. The final stitch was imminent and all the sailors held their breath as Finger took the great silver needle, slender and sharp as a blade, and grinned at the men about him. With one strong, sure stroke, Finger grasped both the fabric and the flesh beneath it, plunging the needle through the cloth and into the septum of Mothwood's nose. Before Finger could draw the needle through, a terrible wail erupted from the shroud, a blood-curdling scream of anguish and pain. These words rose up to join the others. They were shimmering between Serendipity and Dennis, sparkling and drifting. Serendipity stood up from her chair and stepped into them, hoping this would remind the words to wrap themselves around her. But they dispersed and scattered before reforming near the ceiling. Then in one single long thread, they swooped around the room before diving out the open window. "No!" Serendipity called. "No!" She lunged after the thread of the silvery tail, but the thread slipped through her fingers as if it was satin. It flew away into the inky depths of the sky. "Dennis!" cried Serendipity, her face stricken. "Dennis, Dennis, Dennis!" But Dennis could do no more than simply peer at the thread vanishing from view. "I think I might have made things much, much worse," Serendipity gasped. "Oh, poor Tuesday. Oh, what have I done?" On the deck of the Silverfish, the singing continued. Tuesday peered up the mast and could just make out a black shape climbing below the flag. Then she saw the dark square of flag disappear, replaced by starry sky. The faintest noise of a jingling reached her as Vivian unscrewed the cleats holding the flag to the mast. The pirate singing ended on a low, mournful note. Finger cut a length of twine and held aloft a huge, curved needle. As he threaded the twine through the eye of the needle, Tuesday saw something unusual. A long filament of glimmering silver drifted through the darkness and wove itself around Finger's thread. The pirates, however, did not appear to have noticed. Every man on deck held his breath as they realized the significance of the moment they were about to witness. Finger gripped the canvas, the shroud around Mothwood, and within it the nose of Carston Mothwood. With a dramatic flourish, he lifted the needle high into the air and then plunged the final stitch into the septum of Mothwood's nose. There was a blood-curdling screech, loud enough to shake the stars in the heavens. Nobody moved. All were struck dumb. The corpse of Mothwood wriggled and writhed, the needle still protruding from the nose. A muffled voice inside the shroud shrieked, "Ah! Get me out of here! Get this thing out of my nose!" The sailors trembled and backed away. "That's not possible," said Flem. "It's not him. Finish the stitch, Finger. Finish the stitch," said Liver. Yes, finish the stitch," yelled several more. But Finger knew his work. This was why the last stitch was tradition. Only the absolutely dead will lay quiet with a sailor's needle piercing their nose. Finger reached out, and with a flourish similar to the one he had used to insert the needle, he withdrew it from the cloth and what was in between. Dawn was breaking, but nobody noticed, not even Tuesday, who was still crouched by the wheelhouse, looking on in utter terror. In a panic, she attempted an owl call to hurry Vivian back to her side, but it came out rather badly and not very loudly. "Hoo, hoo," she called. She tried again, a little louder this time. "Woo, woo." The sailors spun about. "It's a bird of death, to be sure," said Flem, his face white with fear. "The owl is here, Captain. Lie down and rest yourself," said Gum, "for an owl has come to guide you through the darkness to the afterlife." From within the shroud came another muffled scream. "I'll not be going anywhere until every one of you is carved into little pieces and fed to the sharks by my very own hand. Now get me out of here." The men hesitated, and then one by one they nodded their assent. Daylight was creeping into the darkness like dye seeps into water. "Don't you worry, Cap'n. We'll have you out in no time. You just hold still," said Finger gently. He admired his fine handiwork one last time, then took a knife and sliced open the shroud. His hands were shaking, and indeed every man on deck was mute with fear as the shroud was pulled away, and there, before them, looking ghastly and broken, with blood oozing from the wound to his nose, lay Carston Mothwood, with the crow Baldwin still dead in the crook of his arm. "Can he not die?" Vivian whispered to herself as she looked down from above. She had stopped at the lowest yard arm, and from here she peeped over the furled sails and stared at the figure laid out below. The captain's head was fixed sidewards, and his arm was dangling unnaturally. One of his legs was still facing the wrong way, but there was no disputing that Mothwood, at least for the moment, was alive. His face was a terrible mix of fury and pain. One eye scanned the shocked faces of the men about him, while the other eye, clearly damaged by the fall, rolled around in its socket as if surveying the lightening sky. And then that eye swiveled to the yard arm and focused itself on Vivian Small perched in the rigging. "Vivian Small!" gurgled Mothwood. "There!" The men stared at the captain in stunned silence. Surely he was hallucinating. "There!" Mothwood shouted, spit flying from his mouth. One arm attempted to wrench itself upwards without luck, broken as it was, and Mothwood was forced to lurch his head upon his shoulders, his eyes each going in opposite directions, his mouth leering furiously at his men. "Around the mast!" he bellowed, almost apoplectic with rage. His men looked up and scattered, swords and knives at the ready, as some made for the mast, some raced across decks, and others took up positions port and starboard. Though Vivian made swiftly for the top of the mast, climbing with all the speed she could muster, she found that when she reached the crow's nest, she was trapped. Her right wing was too badly damaged for her to attempt a flying leap to one of the other masts. Without her wings, she would certainly fall to the deck far below, breaking as many bones as Mothwood himself. From beside the wheelhouse, Tuesday watched Vivian's plan unravelling. The pirates climbed higher, coming at her hand over hand. One of them grabbed at her legs and another hauled her backwards. Despite her best efforts, she was dragged swiftly down to the deck and tightly trussed. It was there that Vivian Small, looking like a roast ready for cooking, faced the grim reality of a Mothwood newly awakened from death. Finger and Gum helped the broken captain into a sitting position so that he might see Vivian helpless on the deck before him. As they did so, the body of Baldwin, tucked into the crook of the captain's arm, fell from the folds of the shroud onto the deck. At this sight, the captain howled. "What has happened to my bird?" He died, Captain, from a... Oh, sorry, phlegm.
He died, Captain, from a broken heart. He laid himself beside you and died,
said Flem, reaching down and picking up the stiff crow and placing him on the captain's lap. Though he tried, Mothwood was unable to touch the bird. His fingers twitched a little at the ends of his useless hands, and his face looked more wretched than ever.
But not before finding the home of this savage,
Finger sneered, jabbing at Vivian Small,
and allowing us to fell the tree that has sheltered her all these years.
Bold one, said Mothwood, clearly distressed by the loss of his companion and not seeming to register Finger's words.
Bold one.
Mothwood's speech was garbled and his movements erratic. Again his arm tried in vain to swing his hand to touch the bird, but the broken limb simply hung, apparently boneless and quivering. Gum lifted the bird away and set him against the mast, where the captain could see his shabby black form. Then Mothwood's head raised itself crookedly, and he looked about again. One of the crew shouted out that they had spied Vivacious tied alongside, and an instant later Tuesday heard Baxter snarling and barking down below. Then she heard him whining and yelping. "No, not Baxter," she said silently to herself, clenching her fists until her nails almost pierced the skin of her palms. She longed to leap out and try to protect him, but what could she do in a fight against these large and vicious men? If she were captured also, then all hope would be lost. She heard the winding of a winch, the creak of a rope running through a pulley. Tuesday's heart was beating so loudly as she pressed herself against the side of the wheelhouse that she was sure someone would hear it, but the men were otherwise engaged. When all had fallen quiet, Tuesday again peeped out across the deck. A terrible sight met her gaze. Bound on the deck was Vivian, and beside her, bundled up in a fishing net, was Baxter. It's a big chapter. But I'm not going to leave it there because it's too exciting. And I don't want you to have to wait, because it would be awful, wouldn't it, to not know how it's going to go. So let's go on to chapter 16. It's not a very long chapter.
"Cut the creature loose,"
Mothwood ordered. It took two men to control the snapping, growling Baxter as he was freed from the fishing net. The sailors secured a rope around Baxter's neck, then pushed one of his paws through the noose and pulled tight to secure him. With a loop made out of a length of wire, they muzzled him, twisting the ends until the wire cut into Baxter's lip. "No, no," cried Vivian Small, "you'll hurt him." Tuesday, tears filling her eyes to see Baxter treated this way, was nevertheless proud to see that Baxter stood fiercely, snarling as best he could. Mothwood attempted to get up from where he sat upon the edge of the table. He dismissed the help of Finger and Flem on either side of him. With great concentration, clicking his broken bones into some semblance of structure, he managed to stand upright. If you hadn't noticed that one of his feet and the knee above were both facing backwards, and that his head was on sidewards, you might have thought he was simply a man struggling with severe arthritis.
"Well, what do we have here?"
he garbled quietly.
"Surely it can't be."
Gaining control of one arm, he swung his hand out towards Baxter, who growled even more fiercely. Mothwood placed his hand on the top of Baxter's head and stroked it. Tuesday felt every pore in her skin shrivel to see Mothwood laying his hands on her dog. Baxter's legs trembled. Mothwood's legs also trembled, but for quite a different reason. Then Mothwood leaned over Baxter a little further and felt along his sides and drew out the damaged wing. Baxter whined.
"So very small," he said, his head clicking towards his prisoner, who lay quietly in her bindings. "A winged dog, even if it is a puny little one. Where did you find him?"
Mothwood's voice was clearly meant to sound menacing, but instead it sounded as if he was talking underwater. Vivian did not reply.
"I've been searching for a winged dog for a very long time, Vivian Small. It's so very kind of you to bring me one. Tell me his name."
Vivian said nothing, though Mothwood lurched closer to her.
"His name,"
he repeated. "I shall never tell you," said Vivian defiantly, "not as long as I live." Mothwood gurgled, and Tuesday, in her hiding spot, realised he was attempting to laugh.
"Oh, I think you will, Vivian Small,"
Mothwood said. His voice was becoming clearer, as if he were getting used to the complexities of talking with a broken neck.
"But if I am wrong and you do not tell me, then you will die. Actually," he considered, "with you dead, the dog will be orphaned and in need of a master. And a winged dog cannot refuse a master, can it? Yes, much simpler. I think we might haul you up the mast and drop you to the deck, so you too can feel what it is like to have every limb in your body broken. Then I think you might have served your final purpose, Vivian Small. Why, instead of this being my end, I do believe it's yours."
Mothwood gurgled with laughter. Baxter continued to growl and bristle with fury. "You're wrong, Mothwood," Vivian said loudly and clearly. "This isn't the end. I'm sure at the end there'd be help that you would never guess at. If I could get there, I'd go as fast as I could and be back, quick as a wink, bringing that help with me. But as I can't leave, I'll just wait for help to come, as I'm sure it will." Tuesday, hearing this, was certain that Vivian was telling her to flee quickly before Tuesday was discovered and was no use whatsoever to either Vivian or Baxter. But how? How could she possibly leave Baxter here? Or Vivian? Tuesday knew that if she were herself captive on the Silverfish, then Baxter and Vivian would do anything in their power to rescue her. But unlike them, she was neither a fearless dog nor a girl with 1,000 adventures under her belt. She was just plain Tuesday, who had never had an adventure before in her life, and who knew nothing about rescuing anyone from the likes of Carsten Mothwood and his crew. It was her mother who had adventures. Her mother would know what to do, and if Vivian was right, Serendipity was almost certainly at the end. Tuesday knew what she had to do. She snatched up the map cylinder from the deck, and with one parting glance to Baxter and Vivian, edged away from the wheelhouse and crept to the stern of the Silverfish. There was no time to lose. Never had she felt so entirely uncertain. Part of her wanted to run back, throw her arms around Baxter, and be willing to die to save him from Mothwood's clutches. And the other part knew that if she did, and Mothwood killed her, and Vivian too, no doubt, then Baxter would be Mothwood's dog forever. And she could not let that happen. She had to rescue him. She had to save Vivian. She had got everyone into this trouble. She had to be the one to fix it. The new day was announcing itself. Pink and red spears fanned up into the sky. For a single moment, a golden sliver of light shot up from the horizon. Peering over the side of the Silverfish, Tuesday saw Vivacious was still there, bobbing on the sea, her sails furled. After capturing Baxter, the pirates had left the little boat unguarded. A breeze sprang up, beckoning Tuesday to set sail. Quickly she clambered over the railing of the Silverfish and down the ladder. She stowed the maps and unhitched Vivacious from the Silverfish. Ever so quietly, she hoisted the mainsail and unfurled the jib. In no time, Vivacious was skipping away across the waves as if the boat knew that this was a grand and urgent escape. All the while, Tuesday dreaded a cry from the pirates as they noticed Vivacious sailing off. Or worse, Tuesday dreaded hearing the cry of Vivian being dropped from the tallest mast onto the deck below. But no cry came. And that is the end of chapter 17. Oh, yes, chapter 16, chapter 16. And next time we'll do chapter 17. Now I'll just have a quick look and see if there's any illustrations that I can share with you. Let's go forward to chapter 15. I'm not sure if there are. Oh, yes, there are. Look at this one. This is great. Here is Vivian trussed up with Baxter on the deck of the Silverfish. The wonderful drawings of Stevie Lewis, who also was one of the illustrators on the How to Train a Dragon series, and that's from the American edition. All right, I will see you back for chapter 17. But for those of you who are writers, just remember that if you're writing a story, you have to give your characters big problems. Big problems. And Mothwood coming back to life is a very big problem, isn't it? So let's see what Tuesday does next in chapter 17. See you then.